Thank you to my board members for joining me today. Quorum has been established. Many of you traveled to be here, and I appreciate your dedication to the board. Before we begin, I have some important ground rules to share. For those of us joining remotely via Zoom, you have been muted upon entry, and you will remain muted throughout today's meeting. Any distracting video will be disabled. Members are joining this meeting from two physical locations connected by video conferencing in Albany and New York City. Today's meeting is an open public meeting, and it is being recorded. The recordings and other details of the board's work will be available on the Department of Labor's website. Now, before I open up the meeting for introductions, I'd like to give a special welcome to our newest member of the board, Albert Catalano, Secretary Treasurer and Executive Director of the New York State Building and Construction Trades Council. Thank you for joining us, Al. I'd also like to thank my Department of Labor staff who are here with us today, including Jerome Tracy, Chief Ethics Officer, and Sean McCready, Director of our Bureau of Public Work. Now, I'd like to give all of my fellow board members an opportunity to introduce themselves, beginning with the members who are here with me in Albany, and I'll start with Dan McGraw.
Dan McGraw, Secretary Treasurer, New York State Conference of Operating Engineers.
Christopher Lund, retired New York State DOL.
Al Catalano, Secretary Treasurer, the New York State Building and Construction Trades Council.
Jim Whalen, President of the Real Estate Board of New York.
Thank you. And in New York City?
Gary LaBarbera, President of the Building and Construction Trades Council, Greater New York.
Hope Knight, President and CEO, Empire State Development.
Peter Thorey, Principal DNF Development and representing New York State Builders Association.
Thank you. At our last meeting, Chief Ethics Officer Jerome Tracy gave a presentation to the board about our ethics responsibilities. If you have any specific questions, he's available to speak with you. Additionally, and as a reminder, each member of this board will be required to complete the annual financial disclosure form in May of this year. Also at our last meeting, we asked the Department of Labor staff to prepare proposed bylaws that will provide a structure to the operations of this council, of this board. Copies of the proposed bylaws were sent to all board members last week, and we have printed copies available for you here today. These bylaws will serve as an important foundation for the operations of this board, including where the board will receive correspondence and who will be responsible for receiving requests for determination or hearings pursuant to Labor Law Section 224C. Now, before we discuss these proposed bylaws in detail with today's quorum, I would like us to consider formally appointing the Director of Public Work, Sean McCready, as the secretary to this board. This appointment is already part of the proposed bylaws. It's in Article 4, Section 3. However, to facilitate our discussion of the bylaws today and ensure that any edits or comments are properly recorded, I think it would be beneficial for the secretary to be formally appointed prior to engaging in the discussion of the proposed bylaws. Therefore, to that end, I move that the Department of Labor Director of the Bureau of Public Work be named as the formal secretary to the board. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Do any of the board members have any questions or comments that we should discuss prior to the vote? Anyone in New York? Okay. Before we vote, I'd like to remind everybody in attendance that only members of the board can vote. Now for the vote on the appointment of the secretary to the board. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? Abstentions? Excellent. It is unanimous. Sean McCready is now this board's secretary. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Now, turning to the proposed bylaws. As we go through each of the articles, Sean will provide a short summary prior to our discussion. During the discussion, Sean will note any comments. So let's begin with Article 1. Sean, please provide a summary.
Article 1 states the Public Subsidy Board's name, authority, and location. Labor Law Section 24-C establishes the board and sets out its powers and duties, and correspondence will come to Building 12 here in Albany.
Okay, thank you. Do any of the board members have any questions or comments on Article 1? In New York? Nope. Okay, let's move on to Article 2. Sean, please provide a summary.
Article 2 states the purpose of the board. It exists to examine and make recommendations regarding a number of enumerated items as set forth in Labor Law Section 224C. The board also exists to issue determinations regarding projects covered by Labor Law 224A, commonly referred to as the Public Subsidy Law.
Okay, do any of the board members have any questions or comments on this article?
I do.
Yes,
So, and I'm not sure this is the appropriate place to insert this, but in the legislation in 224C, Part 7, it states that the board, in the event that the board finds that there's likely a significant negative economic impact, that the board has it may temporarily delay the implementation. Would that be something that would go in here? I don't see that here.
I'm going to turn to the secretary.
So the power to delay implementation. The powers. I mean, the bylaws are essentially the overall.
224C, Part 7.
No, I know the section of law. I mean, the bylaws themselves are just the overall framework, essentially establishing the board's powers and role. And it's reference to the powers coming from 224C. I don't think it precludes the ability for the board to exercise that clause just because it's not specifically enumerated in that article of the bylaw.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Good, thank you. And for the folks,
Commissioner,
yes, could you each state your name in case people?
Gary
don't know?
LaBarbera, I'd just like
Sorry.
to make a comment, I think, on behalf of that. So 224C talks about extending the board's meeting, correct? Not the implementation of the law. Because
This is Peter Flory, sorry. The board may temporarily delay the implementation of such requirements beyond January 1st. That's what it states.
requirements, so, I mean, we could turn to the secretary.
Right. I do believe the section does give the board the power to delay implementation of the law. Again, it's in effect since January 1st of last year. So
Okay, that's the question that I want.
Yeah,
So the law is, it is agreed that the law is in effect since January of last year.
right, the Bureau of Public Works interpretation, it
Okay,
didn't require the board to be in existence for the law to actually
right. And that's
exist and to go into effect. Yes.
right. That's the clarification that I wanted. Thank you.
okay. Any other conversation about that? All righty, then we are up to Article 3. Could you please provide a summary?
Article 3 covers membership and compensation. There's no salary for serving, but members may be reimbursed for necessary board expenses. Generally, this will cover train tickets and mileage. And after today's meeting, I'll be distributing additional information to all the board members, including the OSC guidelines.
Good, so we'll clear that for everybody. Anybody have any questions about Article 3? All right, moving on, Article 4, Sean, please provide a summary.
Article 4 covers the duties and powers of the board chair. The Commissioner of Labor serves as a chair by law, presides over and calls meetings, and may assign Department of Labor staff to provide support to the board. The article also designates me as the Director of the Bureau of Public Work, Board Secretary. The Secretary receives and maintains board correspondence and provides reports and information to the board as necessary.
Do we have any questions or comments on this particular part? So correspondence goes to him. All right, Article 5, please.
Article 5 sets the basic parameters for board meetings. Regular quarterly meetings will be held, plus additional meetings as needed, with proper notice provided. 7 members will constitute a quorum and may only be counted if present in person or via video conference under circumstances set forth in Section 103A of the Public Officers Law. The board is to adopt a procedure for holding hearings.
So do we have any questions or comments about this article? Okay, great. Moving on, yes? Oh, sorry. Moving on to Article 6, Sean, please provide us with a summary.
Article 6 covers the requirements for voting and attendance. Votes must be in person or via video conference in accordance with the Open Meetings Law and are decided by a majority, which is 7 members. No board member may be represented by a proxy for the purposes of voting or counting towards the quorum.
Correct. Do we have any questions or comments on this article? Okay. Moving on to Article 7, Sean.
Article 7 sets the procedure for amending the bylaws. 3 or more members must submit a written proposal to the chair, and a 2/3 majority or 9 members must vote to adopt.
Again, Any comments, questions? Thank you. Article 7. Oh, no, was that Article 7? That was 7. Moving on to Article 8, the last article in the proposed bylaws. Could you please provide a summary?
Article 8 covers publicity and confidentiality. Statements released on behalf of the board require a majority vote, and any proceedings relating to a particular individual or project shall be kept confidential.
Okay. Any questions or comments on that? Great. Well, thank you for that. Now we have reviewed the bylaws and agreed upon the language in each article. I move that we adopt the bylaws consistent with our discussions in this meeting. Do I have a second?
Moved.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Excellent. So by unanimous vote, the motion carries. The bylaws are now established. Next on our agenda is a proposed policy and resolution on the ability for board members to attend meetings by video conference, as well as written procedures governing the ability to attend by video conference. So Sean, could you please walk us through the proposed resolution and procedure on video conferencing for this board?
The resolution is a requirement of Section 103A of the Public Officers Law in order to authorize the use of video conferencing under extraordinary circumstances. The law further requires established written procedures, which have also been provided to you all. The procedures enumerate what can be considered extraordinary circumstances and allows for significant and unexpected events which preclude a member's physical attendance. The chair must be notified if a member cannot be physically present to properly notify the public. A quorum requires 7 members participating in person at the designated physical location or locations of the meeting. A member participating via video conferencing may vote only if there is that quorum of physically present members. It shall be ensured that members participating via video conference are noted in the minutes and can be seen, heard, and identifiable by their full names displayed in front of them. Open portions of any meeting where extraordinary circumstance video conferencing is utilized shall be broadcast and recorded and posted to the DL website in 5 business days. The public shall also be provided the option to attend open board meetings via video conferencing if any of the members are authorized to do so. The procedures shall be posted on the DOL website as well.
Okay, so let's open the floor discussion related to this. Do we have any concerns? Is it clear to everybody how you participate? Most of this is really dictated by the public meeting law, not necessarily by us. All right. Okay, so let's move to a vote on this topic. Do I have a second?
Moved.
Yes. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Not voting? Again, unanimous. Thank you very much. The video conferencing resolution and procedures have been established. The final order of business for today relates to our scheduling for the next 2 years. We will be holding meetings on the last Wednesday each quarter throughout 2023 and 2024, except during the holidays in December. The schedule will be posted on our website. We're doing this far enough in advance so everybody has an opportunity to know exactly when these meetings are going to take place. The board can also meet on an as-needed nature. If there are reasons to meet outside of an established meeting date, please reach out to the secretary of the board so that we can call a new meeting. This brings us to the end of today's agenda. Preparing for the next meeting, I would like us to work towards establishing a process for hearings. As you know, Labor Law 224C requires that the board hold public hearings prior to making a recommendation or determination that applies to all projects, and hold confidential hearings prior to making a determination related to a specific existing or potential covered project. To facilitate that process, I move to direct the secretary to develop a process for how these hearings will operate, and that will be presented at the next board meeting. Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, before we vote, I want to hear from you. Do any of the board members have any questions or thoughts about this direction to the secretary, or what should be included in the process? This is how we hold hearings, both public and confidential.
Yeah, I'd just like to raise a
Your
topic.
name is?
Jim Whalen
Thank
from
you.
the Real Estate Board of New York. I'll practice, make sure it's a little more timely. It's something I've discussed with some members of the board. There's a number of key definitional terms that need to be fleshed out. And it would be hard to apply the law to a specific project without those issues being resolved. So it would strike me that that's got to be the initial focus.
Okay. Any other comments or concerns first to his issue and then anything else you want to bring up about hearings? Because this is going to really be pivotal. This is pivotal to how we operate.
So maybe I missed it, but
And you
Al
are?
Catalano, New York State Building Trades. So how would the hearings be initiated? Would it be a single board member who could initiate it, or?
Let me turn to our secretary.
Essentially, that'd be part of the process to be developed and present to you guys. It can really be up to us. I mean, presumably, if a member wishes for there to be a hearing, I can present that request to the chair and first circulate the request to the other members and find out what the desire to have a particular meeting is, if how soon it wants to be held, and then the chair can figure out if the meeting can be held sooner than the next quarterly meeting to accommodate that, or if that next meeting would be an open hearing. Again, there are other hearings that would have to be at least partially confidential when we're talking about specific projects for determinations, which is a separate issue from the definitions, because again, the discussion about particular projects, people have to be kept confidential. So that would all be part of that process.
So, question, Dan McGraw, operating engineers. Not to get away from your point, Jim, but in the proposed procedures, if a contractor or a union or anybody has an issue or a question whether something should be covered, they're going to go to your office, I believe. Is that to you directly first?
Right. At present, that's the only place they have been able to go. So we've fielded a couple of them, but yes, it would essentially come to me in my role as a secretary for those requests to be presented to the board. And then the procedure that we'll have to develop to vote on at the next meeting would involve the specific mechanism for getting that meeting hearing to make that determination called as soon as possible.
So what discretion would you have? Like if there's a question, or is every question going to be presented to the board, or are you going to filter out questions? Or
Well, that would be part of the proposal. As part of the proposal, I intend to present to the board. It would actually include thresholds like that. You potentially say if a project is only 3.5 million or under, maybe that's the threshold where we cut it off and say there's no way it's going to get close enough to 5 million to really be a covered project. So maybe we can cut it off then. Again, that would be for the board to ultimately decide. I would just make the recommendations as to what those thresholds could be based on how we've seen enforcement kind of go.
I mean, I would imagine it's like how we do business right now. There are certainly many projects that don't apply to this law. Their financial threshold is much higher. And so they wouldn't come to the board because there's no question. The only ones that are going to come to this board, I think, are ones that are in a fairly narrow window. And that's actually determined by some of the conversations we have to have in this board. That's what you were referencing.
Right, the definitional
Right.
terms, right.
Yeah.
So Jim Whalen, Real Estate Board of New York, the other thing I just suggest with respect to hearings is the ability to submit written testimony in the event someone's not able to testify in person.
That's, as I understand it, we're going to put all of that into the procedure, but normally for public hearings, there is an opportunity for people to speak and to submit written testimony. I would imagine it will probably be the same. Yeah, because these will be potentially pretty in-depth commentary.
So this is Peter Flory. So I just want to be clear. In the legislation, it states that the board will be making a determination as to definitions. Is that correct? I mean, there's certain definitions that were left in the legislation, I believe, to be decided by the board. Is that what we're saying here?
Yes, there are things that are enumerated in the law that we will decide those definitions. There are, I believe, some thresholds, and then there's the construction definition. And
Right.
there's another one, I don't have it right in front of me, but that will also be the purview of this board. And because those would apply to every project, I believe those would by nature have to be a public open meeting, correct? The definitions,
I believe so.
yeah. The only time we do private meetings is when you're considering an individual project. And that necessarily can't be public information. Any other questions or concerns or things you would like the secretary to consider when he's writing up the procedures. I mean, I would imagine we're going off procedures that we've used for other public boards, so it's not original. But, you know, but if there's something that somebody wants to flag for us, we're very happy to put it in for consideration. It all comes back to you and you vote it up or down or edit it. Okay. So if we're good on this topic, if there's no further conversation, Sean has our secretary, has his charge soon. Let's go to the vote. We're going to vote to charge the secretary to bring back the recommendations for us on how these hearings will be held. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed or abstentions? Excellent. We are unanimous. So we have directed the secretary to develop a process for the conduct of hearings before this board is approved. Before I close, is there anything else that the board would like us to have a discussion about today or to consider for future meetings?
I would just, Commissioner Gary LaBarbera again, I would just, because it's not perfectly clear in my mind, forgive me. To Jim's point and to Dan's point and to Peter's point, in terms of those issues where there are definitions required, when will we be taking that up at our next meeting? Is that what we're saying? Is there a charge that has to go to the secretary regarding, you know, his recommendations there? How are we going to do that?
So we have to set up, the next thing we have to do for, you know, before we can do anything else is get our procedures down so we know how to do it. But we can certainly charge the secretary to consider a calendar for these considerations.
But Jim Whalen, Gary, if I understood your question correctly, and just to reflect my understanding of this conversation, is public testimony would be taken on the public view of some of these definitional terms.
Yes.
Okay, before the board makes its decision.
Well, if it's a public hearing, you're going to hear people either come and testify to us in person, or they'll submit written testimony of their considered position on these topics.
Right.
Then you're going to take time to consider, and that may mean that you adjourn and take time to consider with your colleagues and then come back.
Right.
That's again up to you.
Okay.
But these are pretty big conversations, so I would imagine they're not going to happen instantly.
Okay.
I have one question.
Can the board members submit testimony themselves?
I think so. Sure. You're appointed because of your expertise. It would be silly of us not to listen to you.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. McGraw.
Yeah, one question, Dan McGraw, operating engineers. So this went into effect in January 22.
Mhm.
So I have to assume there's been inquiries to DOL from contractors or unions about projects that may or may not be covered. I'm just curious what we've done with how we responded to those inquiries, given the fact that we haven't met.
Right. So essentially, as my role as Director of Public Work, we've received some, not an extensive number. When they've come in, I've essentially reviewed them with my senior staff and with the person submitting the request. We've asked for any supporting documentation necessary, proof of the subsidies or the funding, to the point where we're satisfied that we could, based on the evidence or information provided, make a determination. For the most part, they've pretty much all not met the definition of the ones I recall, for one reason or another, be it one of the exemptions, like the historical tax credit, or one of the things in the law that automatically exempts the project has typically come up in the ones that I've been asked about. But again, it's really only been a handful so far, though we're anticipating that's going to change relatively soon.
Chair, I have a question for the secretary. Can you give us a sense of range of magnitude, the number of inquiries you've gotten since the law's gone into effect?
And that was Hope Knight speaking.
Thank you.
Honestly, the number that's been brought to me directly is probably no more than a dozen.
Okay.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And
Mhm.
different forms, some areas have already developed. I think like the Monroe County idea has a whole form that lays it all out and specifies subsidies and percentages and various things. Others, it was more of a general inquiry because they have less of an idea of the law itself. So they've come in and kind of no regular format. And again, it's only been that kind of handful or so.
Okay, thank you.
But one follow-up, so those that weren't clear cut, before. Will that be brought to the board? I know we still have to get our procedures.
Yeah.
Approved, but were there any that are questionable that would be subject to interpretation by the board?
There's none sticking out in my head. I can go back and see if there's ones that I've looked at. That's, if there's any question, I can bring them to the board. If nothing else, just as examples. But again, if there's any threshold the board wants to at all to set for ones that we would automatically weed out, that'd be up to the board. It doesn't necessarily have to be. And the ones that I've decided so far, again, it's come with the caveat of this decision that it's, doesn't apply, is predicated on the fact that I am simply making a decision of how enforcement would go in the absence of a board decision here. Noting, everybody I've given that answer to, that if the board was constituted, it could revisit this issue and it would really be up to them. They have the final decision making power.
Yeah. I mean, to be frank, my perception of the functioning of this board is that you will make the definitions that you're charged to make and you'll have a process available. But hopefully the majority of projects will be very clear. It will actually be a relatively small number of projects that are gray. You keep calling them the gray area. And those are the projects that were brought to this board to consider and make a determination on. So it's not, I don't expect this board to be meeting constantly about projects, as I think most of them are pretty obvious. But the gray ones, yes, we need to do our determinations, have our process, and then they'll come in to you.
Right. And part of the procedure would be the process of presenting it to the board. So you'd have the opportunity to decide if you want to make the determination on it. Again, the board may make a determination. It's not obligated to.
Yeah. Okay. Do we have any other questions or concerns you want him to consider while he's putting his material together? All right. Well, thank you. This has actually been a really good discussion. I feel like the ship is leaving the dock into the harbor. Soon we'll be out in open seas where it might get rough, but never know. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you. This concludes our meeting, and I thank the members of this board for being here and for your service to the state of New York. Materials, including recordings of this meeting, will be available on the boards and committees section of the Department of Labor website. Thank you very much for attending. Have a great afternoon.